Mel, thank you so much. I just love you. And I'm just deeply honored to be invited to the See, Hear, Love conference, Making Space, Loving Your Neighbor. And I am just totally thrilled. I am from Fort McKay First Nation. We're one of Canada's 634 First Nations in the nation. And so we are your neighbors across Canada. And as Indigenous people, we are very diverse coast to coast to coast. And the reason for the diversity is that our whole way of life came from the land. All of our food, shelter, clothing, tools, toys, medicines, everything came from the land. And the land is so different. And so that's why we are so diverse. And so that's why it's always proper protocol whenever we start off a meeting to do a traditional land acknowledgement. And like Mel said, I have a film company, and I was asked by the Arctic Winter Games to do a land acknowledgement that's going to be shown at every sporting event on the Jumbotron. Cool, eh? And so I did this land acknowledgement video of my territory. And so I did some research around land acknowledgements, and I was like, why are we doing land acknowledgements? Like, what does it mean to us? And really what it is Canadians saying, okay, we've been here for a few hundred years, but Indigenous people have been here for time immemorial. And so that's why we do land acknowledgements, to say where we now live, work, play, and worship has been traditional territory for time immemorial for Indigenous people. So let's watch this.
Tansei, Eglanete. Welcome. Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo acknowledges Treaty 8 territory, ancestral and traditional land of the Cree, Dene, and Métis people. We are thankful for these borrowed lands, along with the traditional teachings and lessons of resilience they offer us, in the spirit of maintaining good relations with others for future generations. As long as the sun shines, the river flows, and the grass grows. We will honor these lands.
So we honor traditional territory. We know that we have been here for a long time, and we are the first people here, whatever historians and scholars debate upon. And we also believe that we are the original people here, and Creator placed us here on this land. So people say, well, what is your deity? What do you guys believe in? And, you know, I have to say that it's very rare that you meet an Indigenous person who's an atheist. We have a really strong faith in Creator because of our connection to creation. And so, you know, in all of our languages, we have a word for God. In Cree, the word is Gitchimanitu, which means the Great Spirit or the Great Mystery. In Romans 1:20, it says, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his internal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. So we do know that God has revealed himself to us. And so we were living very well for time immemorial. We were well established. So we were not standing on shores of the Atlantic like, someone from over there across the pond, can you come help us? Because we had government, politics, warrior societies, art, science, technology, medicine. We were well established. And so when Europeans first came across the pond, of course, they couldn't live in one of the harshest countries in the world without assistance. It was the First Nation people that really helped. And so we were like, dude, you need to change your shoes and your clothing because you're going to get sick. And if you get sick, all the medicine actually comes from the land. And here's how you survive. Not just survive, but thrive. And there was this deep relationship. So Europeans depended on First Nations. Let's repeat that again. Europeans depended on First Nations. That was the original relationship. And so, of course, it changed with the arrival of more Europeans, fur traders, missionaries, explorers, RCMP, to start to go across the nation with the national dream, the taking up of the land, the concept of terra nullius, it's just wide open, but it's not. It was traditional territory. And so battles over the land took place. And then the government created this piece of legislation called the Canadian Indian Act. It was created in 1876. So what they did is they said, there's all of Canada, and then there's First Nations. And we are actually the only ethnicity in all of Canada that has a government department. I wish that Canadians understood the Canadian Indian Act more. We've been really negligent on sharing the Indian Act. I think that it has been because we take real pride that we're nice, and the Indian Act shows that we're not nice. And I do have to say it was based on a racist ideology. We'll just take care of the Indians because we seemed like we were less than. Please study. I'm going to show you some books, but we're also going to send you the book and film list. So don't fret if you don't get the book. But this book called 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act, highly recommend. I actually just ordered it on audiobook, so when you're chopping or chopping vegetables or driving or whatever it may be, you can just pop it in, and I highly recommend that book. But I think the most harmful of all the policies within the Indian Act was a policy of assimilation, where they said the best way to assimilate the Indians into Canada is to take the child from the families. And the wording was to kill the Indian in the child. So they opened up 139 Indian residential schools. They were operated by church organizations, and it was the RCMP that started to go to the families and take the children. So can you imagine a knock at the door? That if the RCMP came, because it was a law, if you're an Indian child, 6 to 18, it was mandatory by law for you to attend Indian residential schools. So the stories that we hear that come out of residential schools are horrific of neglect and abuse. So the government, the churches, the RCMP, they were all in it together. Those three groups are where Canadians lean on if they need anything. For Indigenous people, we avoid those three groups because we have a severed relationship. And so I know this to be true personally because my mom was living in our traditional territory, really being practicing what we call Indigenous way of knowing and being, our beautiful ways, and even speaking her language. She was totally loved. But because of that government policy, the RCMP came to Fort McKay, and it was Christmas time. The river was frozen, and they came by dog team, and they came and took my mom. And there was no conversation, like, they didn't even speak the same language, but there was no conversation saying, this is where we're taking them, this is what's happening. And so they just took her by force. And I've heard that the whole community was so full of grief, they cried for days. And the kids were instructed, if you ever see anybody coming down the river, you have to run and hide because they'll steal you. And I've heard this from different people from across Canada that say, when a strange car pulls up, children hide because we are afraid that they're going to take our children. So do you see how the anger and the hatred, the root of it took place? So my mother was 6 years old, my auntie was 8, the little auntie was 4, and they went off to Gruard Indian Residential School. My mother spent 13 years there, and home had no idea where the little girls went, and they had no idea how to get home. The stories are true of neglect and abuse. And what happened when my mom was 18, she gets off on it was her 18th birthday, and they put her on a bus because her funding runs out. They put her on a bus, and the bus takes her to Edmonton. So the ticket drops her off in Edmonton. What happens after that? She said it was a nightmare. There was predators waiting. The police were charging on vagrancy, which means you have no job, no home. She's like, how am I going to get a home? I have no money to secure funds, to have a safe place. It was a nightmare. And most of the children ended up as skid row casualties. 90% of residential school survivors ended up with a mental illness, depression, anxiety, addictions to more severe forms. And many of them commit suicide. And the other thing is, hurt people hurt others. So because of that historical trauma that happened with our people, which has now been defined as a cultural genocide by our Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin, by Justice Murray Sinclair, by the United Nations, we are in the legacy of that, of 150 years of colonization and unilateral decision-making by the federal government. And so if you want to learn more about residential schools, I think it's an important topic that Canadians, in order to move forward, we really need to know where we come from. This book, it's called A Knock at the Door. It is a tough read, but I will say that this is a book. And also, I made a documentary on my mom's residential school story, and if you want to watch that, it will be in your book and film list. It's called A Mother's Voice. You can find it on YouTube. So how do we move forward from that? I am the daughter, a second generation of a cultural genocide. I was so fortunate because I was hurt and angry. But when I was 20 years old, I had a house guest when I was at university that had just come from Australia from going to Bible school. And in his gentleness and kindness, in speaking the truth with love, he taught me about Jesus, the Bible, and my life was transformed. I found healing. The same organization that my mom, in a church-run residential school that was so oppressive, that I found healing. And so I was very fortunate, and I am so thankful to the relationship that I have with my Creator, and that I can look at Scripture every day and find that His mercies are new every day, that there's such a deep love, and that I'm so blessed to be an Indigenous woman who is a Bible-believing follower of the Jesus way. So what happened was, people really are hearing all these stories and they want to make it right. A few years ago, 3 commissioners went across Canada and they listened to 7,000 stories in 300 communities. So could you imagine 7,000 stories in 300 communities? And what they did is they compiled a report. And within the Truth and Reconciliation final report, there's 94 calls to action. And so Canadians are like, we adopted it because when Justice Murray Sinclair said, here, Canada, here's the report, now let's be friends. And I echo that sentiment, let's be friends. After he heard 7,000 stories, the enormity of that task. Well, within this, there's 4 calls to action, 58, 59, 60, 61, to the church on apologies and reconciliation. So reconciliation is really a buzzword, and people are like, okay, how do I do this? And I would say, well, first, there's a truth. So I would invite Canadians to say, reconciliation starts with me. And do your own truth finding. So wherever you get, your books from, your podcasts, your audiobooks, your YouTube viewing, type in keywords. And I do this regularly. I especially love the children's books that I can get, that I can share with my grandchildren. But I was recently on a panel where they paired a non-Indigenous theologian and an Indigenous Christian. It was so great. And they invited us to read this book as a launching conversation within the pairs. And it's called Indigenous Rights. And I was like, well, I don't really need to do this because I do Indigenous Awareness Training and I don't really need to do this. I'm reading it for the 3rd time. I love it so much. And I love it that her last name was Vowell and she writes books. But anyway, after every chapter, there's footnotes. You could be in here forever. I highly recommend that. And, there's just so many books within the book and film list that we're sending you. And, do the same with your music, every genre of music that you can imagine that is, available to us. And our films, we were so influenced by cowboy and Indian movies for so long that so many people developed these unconscious biases that we were like savages and we were, a certain way. And media has a strong influence. And it has a far reach. So that's why I feel so privileged to be working in film and television, so we can have an authentic Indigenous voice in our stories, that we are changing the narrative. And so the other thing that I love doing that I would highly recommend is for you to go to museums and cultural sites, not just to learn about our history, but our collective history, and find out whose traditional territory you're on. I do this everywhere I travel. And if I'm traveling for work, like remember back in the day when I used to travel, but when I travel for work, I always tack on an extra day to go to a museum or cultural site. And the other thing is you can take courses through there too, or you can go to your local parks and recreation or whatever it may be. The other thing is a lot of times people say to me, is it okay if I buy, wear, use, display Indigenous art? And I have friends that are creatives and I ask them this story and their answer is yes, please. Here's a rule: buy from inspired Indigenous, not Indigenous inspired. Therefore, you're appreciating the culture, not appropriating the culture. And I love it. Use it for your giftings. It's Canadian. Even if it's small or big, it's so beautiful. I buy my art intentionally so that I could walk around, show you around my place, and I could tell stories about each piece that are so beautiful. Our stories are so rich, and we love sharing our culture. Go to cultural events when they, are available to you. Now, do yourself a favor. Ask the people that invited you, is there any do's, any don'ts that I should know about so they don't make any blunders. And the other thing is that, I really would recommend is, I know there's this really dark history to learn about, and it's really important to learn about. I really wish that Canadians took more of a formal stance in education, more of a personal desire to learn more. But once we learn about that history, let's not focus on that, because whatever you focus on gets bigger. Let's focus on our successes, because I will say that Indigenous people, despite everything that we've gone through, we are so strong and resilient. We're kind, we're generous, and, full of humor. And my granddaughter said to me the other day, she said, I love being Indigenous. She's 8 years old. And I was like, oh my gosh, my heart just melted. And she said, yeah, because all my Indigenous family, they're doing cool things. So let's focus on the cool things. That, whenever I find a story that is Indigenous success in business, arts, recreation, athletics, whatever it may be, I focus on it. I share it with my family so we can, focus on that so we can see that that's the norm. Whenever I see a magazine or a book, I have it laying around. If there's someone that looks like me on a cover of a magazine, I grab it off the newsstands. And so just to really focus on that. And I think that we have to stop saying, church, let's stop saying, what can I do for Indigenous people? And let's start saying, what can I learn from Indigenous people? Because we have a beautiful Indigenous way of knowing and being. We have so many ways that we can learn from. And, we're not a problem to be solved. And the other thing, if you hear anybody talking negatively about an Indigenous person, issue, community, let's stop the narrative. And I, change it. My pastor, he has a really great solution for this. He always, somebody's talking even in a racial tone, he puts up his hand and he says, we don't talk that way anymore. Now, if sometimes you're taken by surprise and you're like, I wish I would have responded in a different way. And I just think if we default to that we're not talking like that anymore. And also, if you're doing your own truth seeking, like I had just suggested, you're going to be equipped on how to answer in a proper way. And so, when I think of when I became a Christian, I have to confess, it's sad but true, but the church was saying to me, either or, you're going to practice your traditional, Indigenous ways, or you're going to be a Christian. Like they were opposing teams. And I was like, no, I can be an Indigenous woman and a Christian. Like it doesn't have to be opposing. Indigenous people don't really separate the natural world from the spiritual world. We really celebrate faith and prayer and all of that. I read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Genesis 1:26 says, let us make man in our image. I'm made in the image of God. In Revelation 7:9, it says, every nation, every tribe, every people, every language is going to be around the throne of God. So that's every nation. We're all going to be together. And I, have to share with us that missiologists will agree that despite 500 years of attempts of missionary work of portraying Christianity to Indigenous people, that only 3 to 5% of us are Christians. And on some reserves, it's like 1%. That's sad because the church has been the oppressor. We have had a bad representation. It is not the way that I'm sure that if Jesus was talking to us face to face, that's not the way that I portrayed love. So it has been, very ethnocentric, and that is a belief in or an assumption that the superiority of a social or cultural group that person belongs to. There's neither beauty nor justice of a gospel wrapped in a European culture. So when we think of Paul, he wrote every letter devoted to a specific people and a specific place, bringing about the illumination of the gospel. And I really love to focus on Amos 5:21-24, where God says, what do I want? And I'm going to listen to that. I want justice, oceans of it. I want fairness, rivers of it. That's what I want. That's all I want. Do we see that amount of justice and fairness? And I think that we have to think of Corinthians in 12. Remember it says where one part of the body hurts, then all of the body hurts. There are Indigenous people that are still in the fallout from the legacy of the Indian Act, from residential school, that are very broken and hurt and wounded. And if we feel anything but love, mercy, brokenheartedness, anything different than that, you're in a danger zone. We need to investigate any emotion that is rising that is not in alignment with God. I ask you to please commit, if you have any guilt, grief, lament, let's bring that to intercessory prayer. So those of us who want to carry the story of the Bible to Indigenous people may be authentic to represent Jesus and not just our cultural version. It's multi-generational work. It won't be easy. It won't be quick. But I think if, first of all, we say, I want to learn the truth, and then I want to change the lens on how I look at Indigenous people in Canada. I want to learn and grow, and I want to pray. And in that is a response of love. And I think my word going into the new year is shalom. We often think it means peace, but it does. And it also means wholeness and wellness. And so may we have that shalom. And I just want to say thank you for making space for me. And may we continue to make space for Indigenous people. May we continue to love our neighbor. Despite all the differences that may come up, may we just continue to love our neighbor. So I just wanted to say thank you for inviting me. I'm just so deeply honored to share this little bit of a story for you. And I hope that moving forward, we have a much better, more meaningful, respectful relationship between Canada and Indigenous people moving forward. So, hi, which is thank you in Cree.